I just found it up here. This is not yours? This doesn't belong to either you or Sean. It was just I found it on the podium.
No, it was no.
Okay, just want to make sure.
No.
All right, no problem. Okay, class. This is going to be a really exciting day like all the other days, though even more so. And we're going to start with Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, the very last movement. I actually happened to hear this a couple of months ago at the LA Phil in a wonderful performance. This is not that performance, since they don't allow cameras and those good recording devices at the symphony. This is interesting for many reasons for us. It was first performed in 1913, so on the eve of World War I. It is famous because when it was first performed in Paris by a Russian composer with Russian ballet, choreographed by the famous choreographer Nijinsky, put on by the famous director Diaghilev, it caused a riot. Half of the audience thought it was the most appalling thing they'd ever heard in their entire lives. And some portion of the audience thought it was the most important breakthrough in modern music that they had ever heard, and there were fist fighting in the aisles. Now, what we're going to miss in this is that almost always in modern renditions, so for example, what I saw at the LA Philharmonic was just an instrumental piece. It's in fact a ballet with orchestration. We're going to miss the ballet part. I'm going to talk about it a little, and I have some pictures of what the ballet looked like and is now represented as on rare occasions when it is done as a ballet. Now, I was lucky enough to hear the final concert of Salonen just 2 weeks ago, where he did another Stravinsky piece, this time with some of the dance. So I have a sense of why this was so shocking, and I'll talk about that after we listen to the music. Now, one of the things I think is so interesting about this is not only its historical importance, but this last movement, which is meant to be a final sacrificial dance in which one of the central characters is sacrificed, i.e. killed in a ritual fashion, is it also captures many of the elements we've been talking about. It captures that something, that mysteriousness, that primitivism in Conrad. It captures something that will be very important when I talk today about Nietzsche, although Nietzsche was not alive when this was performed. So let's hear it. We have okay, so once again, the music allows us to bring some themes from the past and to look a little forward. Think of the difference between this piece of music and Handel and Mozart, where we started. None of the kind of light, harmonic, rhythmic, but not rhythmic in a threatening kind of way. Stravinsky captures that spirit that we can call, and was called then, the fin de siècle. Everyone used the French term, the end of the century, because people felt they were on some kind of turning point. And for many, increasingly after 1900, this is a turning point they expected to turn with the coming of war, which we'll talk about next week. So there was this kind of expectation that war would respond to this upsurge of primitive feeling, and it would, through violence, provide a kind of catharsis. And we'll see how wrong that turned out to be in World War I. But Stravinsky captures that because it's sort of mythological, it's based on a kind of primitive ritual, and the interesting thing about the choreography was it broke all the rules of choreography. The original dancers are very similar to the ones in the upper right here, if I can find my pointer. And actually they're wearing what we would say were sort of Central Asian costumes. Stravinsky was playing with some of the themes from the history of Russia as well. And the movements of the choreographers, of the dancers were anything but fluid ballet-like movements. When they did Oedipus Rex of Stravinsky at the LA Phil, they captured this perfectly. It was set, the stage was set, and the choreographic direction was run by Peter Sellers, a very famous opera sort of producer. And the movements were all very jerky movements, not at all your standard choreography. In other words, a challenge to the notion of beauty. What constitutes beauty? And getting people's attention to think about what is art, what is dance, what is music, what is it for, what is it about. And as I said, it also brings up themes from Nietzsche that we're going to talk about today, and certainly from Freud, and certainly from Conrad, but given the life of Stravinsky, also moves us forward. He ends up moving to California, where he carries on a feud for decades with the other great master of modern music, Arnold Schoenberg, after whom Schoenberg Hall is named at UCLA, because Schoenberg taught at UCLA, and the two of them were sort of in a constant battle about who was the important innovator in 20th century music. Okay, so that sets the scene for us. Now, today, we're going to only talk about politics very much towards the end of this lecture. Today, we're really going to focus on intellectual and artistic developments. We've had so little time for them as we've gone along because we've had so many things to cover. And I'm going to linger today especially on Nietzsche and Freud. You're concentrating on Nietzsche in your discussion in section. How many of you have read Nietzsche before? I know the people in cluster have. Not that many. You don't know what kind of trouble this is going to get future people into, because I might put Nietzsche in instead of Conrad, since you all read Conrad in high school already. But Nietzsche, trust me, is a lot less easy to read than Conrad, as you might have seen from the selection for this week. Now, what's so interesting about the fin de siècle is that we have coming together a set of developments that constitute a complete challenge to the ideas of the Enlightenment. We didn't spend enough time on the Enlightenment to have this really imprinted on your minds. So we'll, in a sense, go back to it now by talking about its opposition. Where the Enlightenment had celebrated reason, the developments we're going to talk about in the fin de siècle challenge the place of reason in the human mind, in the case of Freud, and in social and political organization, as we'll see in the case of the Dreyfus Affair and the rise of anti-Semitism. It challenges the belief in unending progress that is established by the Enlightenment. As we'll see in the case of Nietzsche, he challenges the idea that we're moving towards greater civilization, greater enlightenment, and greater understanding. So what's happening is we've got new theories of the mind, in the case of Freud, new philosophies, in the case of Nietzsche, that are emphasizing the other side of the human being, the not rational side, the irrational side of the human being. In art, we have the emergence of one of the most important shifts in Western art since the establishment of linear perspective in the Renaissance, and that is a kind of breakdown of the notion of art representing the world. Now, art represents the world, but not as it is seen by the human eye. And we'll see how that works in Picasso. Cubism sets the stage for what will come in the 20th century, the disappearance of the human figure from painting. Doesn't disappear from sculpture, although even there are challenges to the centrality of the human figure. Walk around the sculpture garden and you'll be able to look at which ones are meant to be representational, that is, capture the human figure, and which are, what we will call it in the 1950s, abstract art. When you finally get right down to it, we'll try to show some of those when we get to the middle of the 20th century, when you just get, in the case of, for example, Mark Rothko, one of my favorites, just color on a canvas. And you're just meant to think about color. I'll show you some of my favorite Rothkos. You have to sort of see them in person, but still. So this begins in this period with an attack on the notion that art is there to represent the world. And instead now, it will challenge the notion of realistic representation. And then, of course, we also have, at the same time, the emergence of a new visual technology, which at first will be used to represent the world. The movie, the moving picture, the film, invented, or we can say, I like to pick as the date of invention, of course, because it's the French contribution, which many people think of as the first film, 1895, right in the heart of the period we're talking about. So something new is arising that will take very different forms as we get towards the present, and I will show you in just a second what many people see as the first movie. Does anybody know who is the maker of this first movie before I get to that slide? Yes. Yes. What is your name? Kirsty. Kirsty or Kirsten? Kirsten. Great. The Lumiere brothers. We'll see them in just 1 second. I have to go back on my YouTube and bring it up. Okay. And then finally, we will talk about the Dreyfus Affair as an example of a more general problem. The most famous example of the late 19th century about the struggle over parliamentary politics. Who's going to control the political arena? What does it mean to incorporate the masses, which I talked about so much on Tuesday, and the rise of anti-Semitism as a different way of organizing the masses, and showing that when we incorporate the masses, we don't always get enlightened politics. In fact, we have the rise, we could say, of irrationalism in politics, starting with the fin de siècle, and of course, culminating in the 1930s, though in the case of the Dreyfus Affair, it's even before World War I. So let me pull up here the first movie, just to show you, just to show you a poster. Let's see if this works. Of course, the first movies were silent, no sound, no narration. There would just be music in the background when it was being played. Now, fascinating. First movie, women, for the most part, a few men, leaving the factory. It's actually the factory of the Lumiere brothers. So here it is, the new working class, the subject of the first movie. I love this dog. It's such a big dog for the late 19th century. I have dogs that are big, but they're not that big. And then out comes the horse and the wagon. Okay, that's great. It's just the same thing over and over again. It's a very short movie. Okay. Terrific. So we have the invention, and what's so great about this is, where is the first movie shown? The first movie is shown in a cafe. Cafes are new in the 18th century with the importation on a mass scale of coffee. And now at the end of the 19th century, it's in a very big cafe that we have the first screening of a movie, because of course there are no movie theaters. And movie theaters will be places originally that used to be places where plays were put on, right? So they're theaters, except now they're movie theaters. And this is a perfect example of one of the great truths of human life, is that new technologies use the framework of the technologies that came before. I know you know that there's great discussion now about whether we can get away from the typewriter as the model for the computer. What is a computer? It has a typewriting keyboard, exactly the same, by the way, as the typing keyboard, and then a screen attached to it. So we have the television married to the typewriter, and that's the personal computer. So we have a very hard time of thinking of new ways of even incorporating the most dramatically new kinds of technology. Same with movies, first appeared in a cafe and then in theaters for the production of regular kinds of plays. Okay, let's talk about Nietzsche. Sorry about a lot of words on the screen, but I tried to get most of Nietzsche in one screen for you. I probably should have done it bit by bit to make it a little easier to see. Now, when you read and discuss Nietzsche, and when you're asked about Nietzsche on the final, as you surely will be in one form or another, the first thing to keep in mind is no one is entirely sure what Nietzsche meant. Okay? So we're going to talk about that today. So when you're thinking and you're reading especially the famous God is Dead segment, the single most famous part of Nietzsche, do not think that somehow you are thick. You are, that you somehow don't get it, because that two-paragraph segment has been studied and studied and studied. Martin Heidegger, possibly the most famous and important philosopher of the 20th century, wrote an entire piece called The Word of Nietzsche, God is Dead, in which he tried to figure out his interpretation. So Nietzsche is deliberately opaque. That's the point to start with. Nietzsche's point is in his presentation. That is, not a linear argument. Nietzsche may have learned to write the 5-paragraph paper as you did in high school, introduction, body, evidence, conclusion, but he never followed that form. He starts in the middle, and he always writes aphoristically. But let's back up a second and talk about who is Nietzsche. Well, of course, one of the things that makes Nietzsche especially complicated is that he spent the last 10 years of his life insane and in an insane asylum. So there has been almost as much writing about what was wrong with Nietzsche as there has been about why Napoleon died in 1821 of something that afflicted his stomach. Was he poisoned by the English? Did he die of stomach cancer? Did he get some kind of chemical when he was on the island of St. Helena? What was going on? Well, Nietzsche has been the subject of the same kind of discussion because he was crazy, completely crazy the last 10 years of his life and could not work. And the original thought was that he had syphilis. Many men, and for that matter some women, got syphilis in the 19th century. It could not be cured. And one of the symptoms, not one of the symptoms, but one of the byproducts of syphilis is you can lose your mind. You will go crazy at the very end. So, but there's this interesting fact in Nietzsche's history. Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran pastor. He was born in Prussia, in eastern Prussia, moreover, near present-day Leipzig. And his father died at age 35 when Nietzsche was just a child. The official diagnosis was softening of the brain. This is no longer one of the diagnostic categories in medicine today. And so it may have been that Nietzsche inherited some kind of either some kind of biological defect of the brain. We're not entirely sure because there was no autopsy on him or his father. Nietzsche is controversial not just because of the way he writes, but because long after he was dead, he became the favorite thinker of Adolf Hitler. Worse than that, his sister became a close confidant of Hitler. His sister edited his work in such a way as to make it fit as much as possible with the Nazi program. So this made Nietzsche incredibly controversial. And because of the way he writes, it is possible to interpret some of the things he says as anti-Semitic. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Actually, we'll talk about that right now. There is no question that Nietzsche makes statements that we today would consider anti-Semitic. He makes negative statements about the Jews, as, by the way, does Marx, who is from an originally Jewish family. In Nietzsche's case, it's very similar to Voltaire's anti-Semitic statements about the Jews. That is, that they both consider Judaism to be responsible for the defects of Christianity, and for Christianity to be responsible for many of the problems of the modern world. Now, Voltaire and Nietzsche had very different ideas about this. Voltaire hated the organized church, and he hated religious intolerance. Nietzsche had a much more far-reaching complaint. To him, Christianity had basically overturned the moral system of the ancients, the Greeks in particular, of whom he was especially fond, and which were the subject of his original study, and had replaced the heroic, noble vision of the Greeks with a vision of society in which it was best to be part of what Nietzsche famously called the herd. The herd meaning like a herd of sheep. That you were just like everybody else. In other words, Christianity encouraged equality before God. It encouraged meekness in the teachings of Jesus. It encouraged not standing up for yourself, not being a warrior. It encouraged nonviolence, meekness, acceptance, what Nietzsche in other places would call a slave morality, being willing to let other people lead you around. Voltaire's complaints were minor about Christianity, if you will, in comparison to Nietzsche, who saw, therefore, the entire progress of Western civilization was for him one of decline, not progress. We had not advanced toward our equality. We had degenerated into equality, and the Jews were responsible for this, along with the Christians. Both of these monotheistic religions represented decline from the greatness of the Greeks. And for Nietzsche, then, the question was how to get back to this. The problem with this was that this kind of vision fit well into elements of the Nazi vision. Now, we're not going to have time to talk about this when we get to the Nazis, truth be told, because there's so much to talk about. But one of the great controversial elements in Nazism was that for many of the leaders, they were actually not just anti-Semitic, which they were violently so, but they were also anti-Christian. in the Nietzsche manner. And they wanted to go back to a kind of pre-Christian, pagan morality of, if you will, the barbarian tribes. And so when Nietzsche referred to the blonde Teutonic beast, that's what he wanted to get back to. The blonde Teutonic beast. You can see how this could easily be sort of dragged over into the Aryan morality, the superiority of the Aryans. Okay? The blonde Teutonic beast seemed to be looking toward Hitler's emphasis on the Aryans as a special race. The race that runs from India to Germany, that's white, that's blonde above all else, and that is to be distinguished from the Southern European groups like the French, the Spanish, and the Italian, and certainly from the Eastern European groups, the Slavs, who are all seen as inferior in Hitler's sort of vision of the racial hierarchy. Now, Nietzsche did not have a racial hierarchy. Nietzsche was violently anti-nationalist. Though he would talk about the blonde Teutonic beast, he meant get back to that in yourself, not elevate one race above the other. It's each individual who can elevate himself, and trust me, for Nietzsche, it was always himself, would be the superior person. Okay, so Nietzsche, in that sense, had no sympathy at all for democratic thinking, or, needless to say, for feminism, which was emerging at the end of the 19th century. So, yes, he says anti-Jewish things, but to just call him an anti-Semite is to miss the enormous difference between his position and that of the Nazis later. He didn't like any isms, because isms, nationalism, socialism, he certainly didn't believe in socialism, liberalism, they were all ways of organizing the herd. And he wanted to be the Superman above the herd. Now, the problem with Nietzsche, who is in many ways an extremely sympathetic thinker, the problem, though, besides this anti-democratic strain, which I think is not sympathetic, the problem is that when it comes down to it for Nietzsche, there's only one thing that matters then, and that is the will to power. So there are elements then of a kind of Hobbesian vision of the world in which power is all important. But Nietzsche's not interested in politics. Nietzsche thinks art is the solution to the problems of the world, not politics. Politics is for the herd. Art is for the Superman who can, within himself, get back to this original self and expand through joy. We'll see what are the things that he really loves. And why he was related to Stravinsky is that I think the thing that really matters to Nietzsche is something like dance. He constantly refers to dance, because dance is a moment when you lose consciousness of yourself. When you become part of something bigger that is not the nation, that is not God, that is still yourself. He was extremely interested in Eastern religions. He was very much interested in Zoroastrianism, all those forms of religion that were about getting outside the self. Okay, so dance for him was the ultimate, because when you're dancing, you're not thinking. Thinking, that Enlightenment thing, thinking and reasoning are part of what have ruined modern-day man, who thinks too much. And in that sense, Nietzsche is a descendant of Rousseau. He wants to get back to the authentic person underneath what society has made him. There could only be a Nietzsche, then, at the end of the 19th century, after the notion that we are constructed by the society we live in had taken root. Had taken root in socialism, had taken root in liberalism, had taken root in all of the isms of the 19th century, were there to show you and gave birth to social science, which would study this, that we are created by the social world we live in. Nietzsche wants to escape that. He wants to say, I don't have to be the son of a Lutheran minister who got a PhD and became a professor in Switzerland, which is what he was. That's not me. I'm the blonde Teutonic beast. I'm the Superman. I'm the person who can understand this enough to transcend it. But so the problem is there's an enormous amount of emphasis on this will to power, on the individual, and as the textbook says, he always preferred the Dionysian to the Apollonian. And the Apollonian, after the Greek god Apollo, means reason, moderation, doing all things in the way they need to be done. Dionysian, after Dionysus, means out of control. There is nothing more Dionysian than Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. This is a perfect exemplification of the Dionysian, in which you just lose contact with reality because you are in such a frenzy brought on by the music and the dance. Okay. Now, what's especially interesting about Nietzsche is not only his fantastic ability to write in a way to challenge the way you think. So he writes in these short paragraphs, these somewhat opaque aphorisms, because he says, I'm not going to tell you the bottom line. I'm not going to tell you what I mean. That's for you to deal with. Okay? But it's not just that. Beneath all of these aphorisms is a counter-narrative of the meaning of Western civilization. And that's why Nietzsche is such a central figure for us. Because he says Western civilization is not about the triumph of reason. It is not about progress. It is not about democracy. It is not about freedom seen as living in a democratic society where you elect your representatives, where everyone is equal under a law. Western civilization is not about the values of the Declaration of Independence and the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. It's about how we have declined because of the triumph of these values. It's how we have become meek, weak, weak-willed, unable to grasp life. And we will see a couple of quotes where this then becomes clear. But this is what's interesting behind the aphorisms, is this anti-narrative, this counter-narrative, this anti-Enlightenment narrative. Okay, so let's take a look at that most mysterious and in some ways shocking of Nietzsche's aphorisms, the short parable of God is dead, which is in the center of your document for this week. Okay, this has led some people to say of Nietzsche that he is nothing but a nihilist meaning somebody who thinks there is no meaning in life. And certainly that Nietzsche was an atheist. But of course, having read the document, you know it's actually more complicated than that. It says God is dead, but it says we have killed him. This is not a standard atheist position. The atheist position is that there is no God. Notice Nietzsche does not say there is no God. He says God is dead. Now, this is, an amazing thing. And this is such an amazing example of Nietzsche's prose, and I want to linger on it for just 1 second by reading it out. Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Okay, perfect example of Nietzsche's use of metaphor. here. Grave diggers burying God. Of course, he doesn't mean to call up a scene where we are literally burying God, but he's calling up an actual scene. It's night, it's cold, there are grave diggers who are burying God. Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? This is an amazing sentence. It's not just that God is dead, but he's saying we should be able to smell his decomposition of his body. Gods too decompose. Gods, plural, that is, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, what exactly does that mean? First thing I want to say about this is an exemplification of what I mean by fin de siècle thinking. Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? What's happening in the 1890s, after Nietzsche has, when he's crazy, and in the early 20th century, before World War I, is some sense that the West is entering a period of decadence. Okay? We've talked about how the West has hegemony over Africa and many other places in the world. Yet, at the same time, within Western civilization, this is the period of the appearance of books talking about the decline of the West, in the famous title of Oswald Spengler. Nietzsche is saying we are in a period of decline. We are in decline because of the triumph of Christianity, the rise of democracy, and our belief in reason. We've lost everything that makes us truly human. Now, Marx thought you were losing what was truly human because the capitalists were taking all the surplus value, the profit, for themselves, and the workers were becoming miserable. Not Nietzsche's vision at all. He's totally not interested in the working classes. Okay? This is more of a spiritual decline. And it is because we have killed God. We have killed what is God in us. We have killed the God, a transcendent, all-powerful, mighty being, because we insist upon seeing God in our own image. So we have reduced God to being like us. There are many ways in which this could be read. That Christianity destroys God because it instead transfers it to the person of Jesus, the Son of God, and the Son of God is, of course, killed, and the Son of God stands for meekness, acceptance, turning the other cheek, all of the things that make us weaklings in the present rather than truly strong. There's much that could be said about what he means by God is dead. You need to think about it for yourself, because that is certainly what Nietzsche would have liked. But what is the solution to this decline? What is the solution to our having killed God? Well, here's where Nietzsche gets himself into trouble. And just a few quotes from the document for us to talk about. Perfect example, again, of the fin de siècle. I welcome all signs that a more virile, warlike age is about to begin. We're going to recapture our warrior selves. And this was exactly the kind of thinking that pushed some people towards World War I. We'll have a great catharsis of violence that will cleanse us of decadence, and we'll move into a new and greater age, which will restore honor to courage above all. To this end, we now need many preparatory, courageous human beings who cannot very well leap out of nothing any more than out of the sand and slime of present-day civilization. Notice, sand and slime of present-day civilization, meaning present-day civilization is just as primitive as original men in the Darwinian vision. Emerge out of the sand and slime of present-day civilization and metropolitanism. This would be, of course, one of the big things for the Nazis. They called it cosmopolitanism, and metropolitanism stood in part for the Jews. I have it down here as code word for the Jews because they didn't live in one place, but it also referred to the rise of urban civilization. All these people moving to the cities, losing touch with their true roots, living in the city was leading to degeneration of the species. And Nietzsche is very much part of this kind of thinking. Okay. I already said he's anti-democratic, dislikes the herd, but what you could have missed easily would be what it is he truly cherishes. And I think this is a really important sentence, also in the document. We need all exuberant, floating, dancing, mocking, childish, and blissful art, lest we lose the freedom above all things that art gives to us. We should be able also to stand above morality, and not only to stand with the ancient. Now here, this is what he hates. We should stand above morality, that's what he likes. What he hates, and not only to stand with the anxious stiffness of a man who is afraid of slipping and falling any moment, but also to float above it and play. How then could we possibly dispense with art and with the fool? This is what Nietzsche identifies with. Nietzsche is the madman who brings the message God is dead. And that's why he says, the madman, I've come too soon. You don't get it. You don't understand what I'm talking about. Nietzsche is the madman. Nietzsche is the fool. Nietzsche is the child. Nietzsche is the one who is dancing. And notice how important dance is to him. Dancing is a key element for him because we lose that stiffness. We lose our self-consciousness vis-a-vis other people. It has to be said, Nietzsche was staggeringly self-conscious, had terrible relationships with women for the most part, never got married, was always in unrequited love relationships. So for him, this had a true personal meaning as well. Stop being afraid of falling down, the stiffness of a man who's afraid of slipping. Dance, be joyful, be foolish, be blissful. That was the only solution. And so Nietzsche is that fool and that madman, a role he relished. Okay. Onward and upward. You will remember the important fact I told you about Sigmund Freud last time, which was that his favorite singer was the cabaret singer Yvette Guilbert. Just kidding, not the most important fact. I just love these interconnections between Yvette Guilbert and Freud, and between Nietzsche and Hitler. There's always going to be connections between Francis Ford Coppola and Joseph Conrad, and both of them with Wagner. This is all, it's all connected. It's a question of figuring out the connections. Okay. Freud, of course, lives longer than Nietzsche. He's slightly younger. He's born 12 years later than Nietzsche. He is himself Jewish, grows up in Austria, at a time when there is increasing anti-Semitism, but where at least Jews by now in Austria can go to the university and become doctors and lawyers. And as we will see in France, you can even become an army officer, and in the 20th century, you can become prime minister if you are Jewish, which one might say is perhaps more than can be said about our own country. Okay, Freud, we associate with the fin de siècle, a time, by the way, when he went to France to study psychiatry with the most famous psychiatrist alive then, whose name you do not need to remember, Charcot, who specialized in the study of hysterical women. And Freud went to Paris to study how Charcot was treating hysteria. Hysteria was a common term in the last half of the 19th century. It could apply to men as well as women, and it referred to symptoms which we don't see in quite the same form today, but which has certain similarities to what we would probably call a nervous breakdown. You can't leave the house, you're completely freaked out, for whatever reason, you can't cope. Many people felt these diseases were a product of the rise of the cities. It was urban living. It was rootlessness that encouraged these kinds of mental breakdowns. Freud is studying in this atmosphere, and Freud, at the very beginning of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, between 1900 and 1910, elaborates an entirely new theory of the mind. Now, what makes him fit this period for us is that Freud emphasizes the irrational components of human behavior. But it is not because he is an anti-Enlightenment man, unlike Nietzsche. He believes that it is reason that unlocks the importance of the irrational. It's not for him to discover this through dance. For him, it's a medical study. There are three things that you need to remember about Freud. One is his emphasis on the unconscious, that what we do is not just a question of what is our intention, what is in our conscious mind, that much of what we do comes out of things in our unconscious mind. Now, many people criticize Freud and say, how do we know that there is such a thing as the unconscious? Well, Freud in his own time said the reason we know there are things such as the unconscious are, this is the second thing about Freud, is dreams. What are dreams? Dreams do not happen when we are awake. They do not represent our conscious intentions. They must mean something. And Freud has a whole way of getting at what they mean. Another thing he would cite is slips of the tongue. When you say, I'm talking about Sigmund Freud, and instead I say Sigmund Fat, there's something going on. She's afraid she's getting too fat. She's afraid there's an unconscious motivation, whatever. But Freud is saying, when you do that, something in your unconscious mind is coming out. Freud also cited, by the way, jokes as revealing things going on underneath the surface. So Freud is very important because he's saying what you are is not what you think you are. There's a lot more going on. So the unconscious, dreams, and the third element in Freud that's so important and so controversial is his emphasis on infantile sexuality. Everyone knows about sexuality, but no one before Freud had talked in the graphic way he did about what the youngest children feel sexually. That boys really want to sleep with their mothers, that girls really want to sleep with their fathers, that there are these desires that then are controlled by social conditioning, but that have a lot to do with the way we experience life. Now, many people at the time said, come on, give me a break. This is definitely not happening. And there was a long period, I would say, not so long, but certainly between the 1970s and currently, there's been a great deal of hostility to Freud's system called psychoanalysis. But, my own personal view here, you don't have to believe in it, what modern cognitive neuroscience has shown is not that infantile sexuality is so important, because no one has done that yet, but it has shown that somewhere between 97 and 99% of our thought processing is in fact unconscious. So we now know much more about the overwhelming importance of unconscious thought processes in our behavior. Indeed, there are some who would argue for an entire overturning of the current paradigm we have of human action. That human action is not about you think, therefore you act. It's you act, and then you think. You act, and then you say, oh, this is why I did that. Not, what should I do? I'll think I'll do that. So we're in the midst of a massive reevaluation about how the mind works, and many of the things that Freud said actually have turned out to have some serious relevance to the way we still think about the mind. So Freud believed in truth. He believed in using reason to get at the truth, but he believed that what it showed was this unconscious self. He called it the id was the part of the self that had all of these unconscious desires in it. The ego got control over them because the superego, that is the system of morality that's incorporated into the mind, tells the ego to act in certain ways. You don't need to know id, ego, superego. You need to know that it fits very much with this period in saying that there are primitive parts of the self that don't ever go away. That's the relationship to Nietzsche. Nietzsche wants to get at them and make them more important. Freud, towards the end of his life, not at the very end, in the late 1920s, writes a book called, that some of you may have read, Civilization and Its Discontents. Has anybody read Civilization and Its Discontents? Did you read it in the cluster? Yeah, okay, good. There he argues that what civilization is about repression of your original desires. And so civilization is always a tension. We don't like civilization because it makes us do things that aren't what we actually want to do. That's what social conditioning is. We have to do things because that's what's socially acceptable. So Freud was very clear on the fact that civilization exacted a price. That price was the repression of your original desires. And then I would just refer you to the document in the reader about the language of dreams. And here, this is extremely interesting in Freud. He wants dreams to speak to us. Okay. Very briefly on the art before we get to the Dreyfus affair. I just picked one of the, it's in the book too, so you can look at it. Picasso's The Demoiselles of Avignon of 1907. The demoiselles are the prostitutes in the street of Avignon. One, in line with some of the things that have been going already on in Impressionism, Picasso here is putting front and center prostitutes, not usually the subject of high art. Also, pushing Impressionism, he is taking apart the representational process. These are not women with, that you can tell they're women, but their faces are all distorted. It's all about, and it's not to show them as ugly, although with Picasso, one never is entirely sure about that, but instead to show how everything is a question of geometry, of geometric spaces. So two things are going on here is that he's showing how it's not smooth lines, spaces made up of volumes, shapes that are geometrical. And also, you notice there is no perspective. There's no linear perspective. We're not seeing depth in the picture. It's flattening the picture because one of the things that's going on, which will be tremendously problematic about modern art in the long run, is this is drawing attention to the fact that a painting is an artifice, is a human construction. It is saying, art is not just showing you a piece of the world that you want to concentrate on. Art challenges you. Art makes you think about the whole idea of real representation. And this will move then in the 20th century more and more towards total abstraction, no figures, just color, or just line and color. Barnett Newman paintings that have just endless lines horizontally and vertically and slight changes in color, and you're looking at it and thinking, what am I supposed to do with this? That's part of the same process of saying painting is about humans making something. It's not about the world. But also I want you to, this is such an interesting picture because it clearly has an African mask. Picasso, and Achebe talks about this, that the Cubists were interested in Africa. He seems to have, it seemed to me that he was a little too, well, the way the Cubists use Africa is all right, but Conrad isn't, whereas it seems to me this is just as problematic as a way of thinking about Africa, because clearly the use of the African mask here is meant to signal primitivism. It's meant to signal something else, a discordant element in the sort of Western picture. Okay, so let us go on to the Dreyfus affair. Now, here's the story with the Dreyfus affair. Don't try to figure out the facts of the case. It's so complicated, it's almost unbelievable. It would be a little bit like my asking one of you, Alex, I would say to Alex, Alex, come up here and give us a short narrative of Watergate. We said, where would I start? Where would I end? And who can possibly remember who broke in, who reported what? The various sets is very similar in that sense, the various sets of lies and counter lies and half-truths. And I was young at the time of Watergate, relatively, and I can't remember the sequence of events. Don't try to figure out the Dreyfus affair. Basically, it's this. A cleaning lady finds an important document in the wastepaper basket in an office. She reports it to her superiors, and for a complicated set of reasons, they decide that Captain Dreyfus, who's Jewish, must be a spy for the Germans. This is the 1890s, 20 years after the French had been soundly defeated in the Franco-Prussian War, and Germany is seen as a mortal enemy. Dreyfus says, I had nothing to do with this. He's court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and sent off to prison, despite the fact that he says, I didn't do it. Meanwhile, evidence comes up that somebody else did it. Basically, the government suppresses the evidence because they don't want to open a can of worms about why did they mistakenly convict this guy. One of the people involved in the affair then commits suicide, and then it's not clear whether he was involved, why exactly he committed suicide. It got extremely complicated. In the midst of this, in some ways, the most important thing, and I'll show it to you in a second, is that the famous writer Émile Zola writes a front-page newspaper editorial accusing the government of deliberately suppressing evidence. Now, this is a Republican government, but he accuses them of suppressing the evidence in order to keep the military happy, and he claims the military is deeply linked to the Catholic Church. And that so this then becomes the Catholic Church and the Army against Republicans who want the Republic to become even more progressive, more socially oriented, and who are increasingly upset about what this says about anti-Semitism. Now, it's very complicated, however, because originally people do not see anti-Semitism as the chief issue. And in fact, many figures on the left are just as anti-Semitic as figures on the right. In the end, this ends up dividing households, neighborhoods, professional groups. People have family dinners and come to blows because families divide over who is a Dreyfusard, that is, who's in favor of Dreyfus. Basically, the more progressive Republicans, anti-militarists, anti-clericals, eventually those who see that it involves anti-Semitism, and the anti-Dreyfusards, the nationalists, the militarists, those against atheism, Freemasonry, and the Jews. This gets brought to head by Zola, who publishes this newspaper editorial, and you have here the page in which it occurs. In the newspaper, a mass circulation daily newspaper called L'Aurore. I won't try to read the French because it's not clear enough in this picture, but fortunately we have some of it in the wonderful document reader, and I'll just read out a bit of it. These, Monsieur le Président, Mr. the President, are the facts that explain how a miscarriage of justice has come to be committed. And the evidence as to Dreyfus's character, his financial situation, his lack of motives, the fact that he has never ceased to clamor his innocence, all these demonstrate that he has been a victim of one of the military men involved, Major Dupaty de Clam's overheated imagination, and of the, and I've bolded it because this is what really matters, the clericalism that prevails in the military circles in which he moves, and of the hysterical hunt, hysterical, notice the word, hysterical hunt for dirty Jews that disgraces our times. Well, Zola's editorial caused a sensation because he was by far the most famous novelist of his time in France. And this was important because this is a society that's pre-television, pre-radio. So print forms are very influential. Not just the newspaper, but Zola was famous for writing novels about the social problems of his time. So he was considered a kind of conscience of the nation. He was also closely related to the leading painters of his time. This is just before Cubism, people making the transition from Impressionism through Fauvism to Cubism. He's linked to all the leading artistic and some of the political figures of his time. Zola, for his pains, is actually arrested, tried for libel against the government, and convicted by the government. In some ways, this is like a perfect pendant to Voltaire's involvement in the Calas case of 1762, 2 centuries or more before. Voltaire is involved because he thinks Calas has been convicted because he's a Protestant, and Protestantism is illegal. Zola gets involved because he thinks Dreyfus has been wrongly convicted because he's Jewish, which does appear to be the case. In any case, what it succeeds in doing, finally the government has to relent. Originally, they don't even declare him innocent. They just pardon him for the crime he did not commit. It takes a long time to have his name completely cleared. The government relents, however, admits a mistake has been made, but in a way the damage is done. There is now enormous division in France. Jews are at the centerpiece of this division. For your interest, it's interesting to note that Hannah Arendt, whom we're reading later on Eichmann, has an entire section on the Dreyfus affair and anti-Semitism in her great book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. So this became a kind of litmus test case. In fact, anti-Semitism was even worse in Austria in this period, much more virulent. But it shows, it's a sort of opening wedge to show that the position of the Jews would become a big issue in the 20th century once somebody decided to act on that anti-Semitism that was present in England, in Spain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in Russia, in Poland, and was infinitely worse in Russia and Poland and Austria than it was in France. But in France, it became a question of state affairs. So for that reason, it ended up having a huge impact. Now, one of the impacts it would have, because the affair is only temporarily over in 1899, it would then lead to, in 1905, the separation of church and state in France. People were so horrified, leading Republicans were so horrified by the role of the Catholic Church in this and their alliance with the military, that the government officially separated church and state, basically insisted that all teaching in state schools be carried out exclusively by lay school teachers. And this was an enormous moment of crisis in France about what the role of Catholicism would be in the future. So the Dreyfus affair, one of the fallouts will be the separation of church and state in 1905. Oops. And another fallout will be that the issue of the Jews will become an issue in the 20th century, an issue that people can use for their purposes. It will become associated, as it was for Nietzsche, with the whole issue of the rise of urban civilization, with cosmopolitanism, with what it means to live in a world where people move a lot, increasingly, between countries. And so along with Freemasons, the Jews would become big symbols in the 20th century, especially for the Nazis. And just one last word on the Freemasons. Freemasons got brought into this because the Freemasons in the Republican government tended to be on the pro-Dreyfus side. in the Dreyfus Affair. And so Jews and Freemasons became linked in the minds of some people, and this would become an issue in the 1930s in all the places that the Nazis would take over, because one of their first things, I think I mentioned this before, is that they would try to prove that there was a Jewish Masonic conspiracy to take over the world and ruin everything for European civilization. Okay, onward and upward, World War I next week. Have a great weekend.